Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're headed over to Ireland, where a really intense situation is unfolding. We're diving into a story where traditional religious beliefs are clashing head-on with some major social changes.
You got it. And we're going to be focusing on this through the case of Enoch Burke, a teacher who's actually been in prison. He refused to use a student's preferred pronouns, and he says it's a matter of religious freedom.
We've got some fascinating first-hand stuff to work with here, including an interview with Enoch Burke's father, filmed right outside the school where all of this is happening.
So get ready, because in this deep dive, we're going to unpack not just the specifics of this case, but also what it tells us about the bigger picture. Think religious freedom educational policies and how our understanding of gender identity is evolving. It's a lot to cover, but we're going to break it all down for you.
Okay, so let's set the stage here. Enoch Burke has spent 471 days in Mountjoy prison. His father says it's because he wouldn't use they pronouns for a student. He claims it goes against his deeply held beliefs.
And that's where things get really interesting. This case brings up these huge questions about the limits of free speech and religious expression, particularly within a school setting. How do you balance an individual's right to their beliefs with making sure all students feel safe and included? That's a tough one.
Absolutely. And then you have the school, Balrow Community School, which seems to be actively trying to be more inclusive, especially for LGBTQ plus students.
Right, they're not just standing by. They actually raised an LGBTQ plus flag for the very first time to show their support, and they timed it with Stand Up Week, which is a national campaign to bring more awareness to LGBTQ plus issues. They're also working with belonging to an organization that supports LGBTQ plus youth, so they're really taking a stand here.
But not everyone's happy about these changes. We hear from Enoch Burke's father, Sean Burke, in this interview, and he does not hold back.
Yeah.
He calls the LGBTQ plus movement and all this talk about gender identity what he calls anti-Christian ideology, and even uses the word perversion. He even challenges religious leaders for not speaking out more forcefully against it all.
This is where you really see that division in society, right? On one side, you have this growing acceptance of LGBTQ plus rights, even legal protections. And then on the other, you have people whose religious beliefs make them feel like their values are under attack. It creates a lot of tension.
Like two completely different worlds colliding.
Yeah.
And then to make things even more complicated, you throw politics into the mix. In the footage, Sean Burke tries to get Martina Jennings, who's running for office, to comment on where she stands on his son's imprisonment. But she totally refuses to comment.
Which just shows you how sensitive this issue is for politicians, especially during an election. They're walking a tightrope, say the wrong thing, and they could alienate a whole bunch of voters. Sometimes silence feels like the safest option, even if it doesn't actually fix anything. So we've been talking about the legal stuff, but we got to remember, this isn't just about laws and courtrooms.
Oh, for sure
We're
not.
talking about real people, you
Right.
know? Enoch Burke truly believes that he's standing up for what he believes in, and now he's facing some pretty serious consequences for it.
Yeah, and you can't forget about the student at the center of all of this. They just want to be called by the pronoun that feels right to them. It's like this huge clash of deeply held values, but it's playing out in this really public and messy way.
It really is. And in a situation like this, there's no solution where everyone ends up happy. No matter what happens, someone's going to feel like their rights haven't been respected.
Which I think is exactly why it's so important to be having these kinds of open and honest conversations about this stuff.
100%.
We need to understand each other's viewpoints and find ways to respect those differences while still making sure society's fair and just for everybody.
And to do that, you need empathy. You need understanding, and you need to be willing to really listen to people, even when you disagree with them.
So let's look closer at those different perspectives. We heard from Enoch Burke's father, and he has a really traditional view on gender and sexuality.
Yeah, and there's a whole segment of society who shares his perspective, and they're feeling increasingly marginalized as social norms change. They see these changes as a threat to their whole way of life and everything they believe in.
It's important to recognize how they feel about it, right? Even if we don't agree with their views.
Exactly. Just brushing them off or acting like they don't matter isn't going to help anything. It's not going to bridge that divide.
It's about finding a way to have those respectful conversations, even when it's tough.
And that's where leaders come in. You know, political leaders, religious leaders, they have to guide these conversations in a way that creates understanding, not more division.
Well, we saw how Martina Jennings, the election candidate, just dodged the whole issue.
Total classic politician move, right?
Yeah.
Don't want to risk losing votes.
But sometimes staying silent can make things worse. It can almost seem like you're siding with people who hold extreme views.
It takes real courage to stand up for what's right, especially when it's not the popular thing to do.
And that's what we need from our leaders, right? Courage. To face these complicated issues, but to do it with empathy and with wisdom.
It's like finding that middle ground between protecting individual rights and making a society where everyone feels welcome and respected.
So this thing that's happening in Ireland, it feels like it's reflecting something much bigger, right? It's happening all over the world.
Yeah.
This clash between religion and social change and individual rights.
And it's not going away anytime soon.
So let's switch gears a bit. What can we learn from this case? What are the takeaways for the average person listening?
One of the biggest things is critical thinking, actually thinking for yourself.
Right, not just accepting whatever you see or hear.
We have to be able to look at information from different sources and make up our own minds based on evidence and facts.
And being able to recognize our own biases, where we're coming from and how that might be influencing our opinions.
Totally. Another crucial lesson is empathy.
It's way too easy to just write off people who disagree with us.
But if we can take a step back and try to understand their perspective, we might be surprised. We might find some things we actually agree on.
And that common ground is so important. It's how we build a society where everyone feels valued.
This case also makes you think about the laws we have in place. They need to protect individual rights, but they also need to protect the well-being of the whole community.
It's about finding that balance, isn't it?
That's the key. We need laws that let people express themselves, but also make sure nobody is being discriminated against.
It's a complicated challenge for sure.
It is, but we can't just ignore it. We have to face these tough questions head-on if we want a fair and equal society for everyone.
Which leads to the question of what's next, right?
Enoch Burke's case is still going through the courts.
And whatever happens, it's going to have a big impact on how similar cases are handled in the future.
It's a situation that's going to keep people talking and debating for a while.
And it forces us to ask some really fundamental questions about our values and the kind of society we want to be a part of. So as we start to wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a few things to think about.
Yeah, like how do we find that sweet spot between individual rights and creating a just and equal society?
What place does religion have in public life?
How do we create environments where everybody feels safe and respected, no matter what they believe or who they are?
Big questions, right?
Tough ones, but they're questions that all of us need to be thinking about.
Because the answers are going to shape the future we're building. We've really gone deep, haven't we? This deep dive into Enoch Burke's case has been a journey. We've seen how those really strong personal beliefs can end up clashing with how society is changing, and how tough it is to balance individual rights with making things inclusive for everybody.
It's like we're at this point where traditional ways of thinking are bumping right up against new ways of understanding gender identity and LGBTQ+ rights. And this case is right in the middle of all that tension.
Yeah, it's been pretty heavy stuff, to be honest. But I think it's good that we've also been talking about empathy, critical thinking, and how to actually talk to each other respectfully even when things get difficult.
At the end of the day, these are real people we're talking about. Enoch Burke, the student, their families, the whole school community, everyone's trying to figure out what to do in this situation where different worldviews are colliding.
It's so easy to get caught up in the legal stuff and all the big ideas, but we can't forget that real people are being affected by this.
Absolutely. And that's where empathy comes in, and we have to try and understand where everyone's coming from, even if we don't agree with their viewpoint.
So where do we go from here? How do we actually start having better conversations about these really sensitive issues?
Well, I think each of us has to take responsibility for our own education. Really learning about the different perspectives on gender identity, LGBTQ+ rights, all of it.
Yeah, and being open to hearing from people who see things differently than we do. We don't have to change our minds, but we should at least try to understand where they're coming from.
Having those respectful conversations, even when they're hard, is so important. We need to be able to talk about this stuff without attacking each other, disagreeing without being disagreeable, right?
Yeah, and we have to support efforts to create environments where everyone feels welcome.
Absolutely. That means speaking up when we see discrimination happening, challenging prejudice, supporting policies that protect the rights of LGBTQ+ individuals.
This whole deep dive into Enoch Burke's case has been a real eye-opener for me. It's complicated and there are so many different angles to consider, but it's shown us how important it is to approach these things with empathy and try to understand each other.
There are no easy answers here, that's for sure. But having those thoughtful discussions, listening to each other, advocating for positive change, those are all things that can help us make a fairer world for everybody.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, We want to leave you with a challenge. Think about what you can do to contribute to a more positive and compassionate way of talking about these tough issues.
What can you do to learn more? How can you engage with different perspectives respectfully and in a way that actually makes a difference?
We've given you a lot to chew on today, but remember, this conversation doesn't have to end here. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep pushing for a better world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into such a complicated and important topic.